don't have a British economic model, we have an economic muddle.
The world economy is now in slowdown.
Investors see more gains in the short term.
People are suffering.
Must get Brexit done.
Austerity is not an economic necessity, it's a political choice.
The global economy is at a delicate moment.
It's just not paying their fair share.
Consumption-led growth.
Climate crisis. Automation.
Another recession.
Rent and housing costs.
Low productivity.
Inequality.
There are fundamental challenges.
2020 is upon us, and now we have a wonderful opportunity to move forward together.
Hello, I'm Caris Roberts and welcome to the IPPR Economic Justice podcast, the podcast that looks at our broken economy and ideas to achieve prosperity and justice from the UK's leading progressive think tank. The UK economy needs fundamental reform, but how do we get there? Drawing on IPPR research and expertise plus special guests, the podcast is a space to focus on the major issues and opportunities facing the UK economy. This episode, we're looking at power in the economy. Who has it? Why does it matter? And what do we even mean by power? One of our core arguments here is that if we're to create a just economy, we'll need to redress imbalances of economic power, from corporate management towards workers and trade unions, from dominant companies towards innovators and entrepreneurs, from short-term finance towards long-term investors, from Whitehall towards the nations and regions of the UK. We need a more active and purposeful state, acting to achieve prosperity, justice and environmental sustainability on behalf of society as a whole. That's got to be decentralised with stronger powers for the nations and regions. With me today are two experts on how to do this through policy and practice. I'm delighted to welcome Councillor Matthew Brown, who is the Labour leader of Preston City Council and Senior Fellow for the Promotion of Community Wealth Building, the Democracy Collaborative. Also with us is James Meadway, who's an economist and an IPPR Associate Fellow. He's also a former advisor to the Shadow Chancellor. So I'll kick off first by that quite knotty question of what do we even mean by power when we talk about power in the economy, and who holds it and why does that matter? James, I wonder if you could kick us off there.
Okay, it's an interesting one because mostly if you study economics and mostly how economists tend to talk about the economy doesn't involve any questions of power at all. It's seen as a sort of a situation where people freely trade with each other. You choose to go out and buy whatever it is that you go and buy from the shops, a banana, an apple, whatever it is. There's no question of power. There's no imbalances of power brought into how economists often think about the economy, which is strange because the thing that confronts you if you actually go out and try and inhabit the economy, and all of us do, is the most apparent thing about it is that this is all about the distribution of power and how power gets used. That I, like everybody else in this room, do not have very much power simply because I do not have very much money. I don't have very much command over what other people can do. And I spend most of my time, because I don't have very much money, because I don't have very much wealth accumulated, I end up having to go off and work for other people and be paid by them. And that's another power relationship that's set up, a really critical one. Through the labour market. So in other words, mostly if we're thinking about how the economy operates, mostly we should be talking about power. It's just that rarely economists ever get around to doing this.
And why is that? Is it something about economics as a discipline, or is it a kind of substantive disagreement?
There's two parts to it. I mean, the sort of historical story, I suppose, is the development of economics as a discipline is one where most of these questions are excluded from what the mainstream of economic thinking chooses to look at. Really in, the late 19th century. I mean, this is the Martialist Revolution, so-called. This is the overhaul of economics to get away from questions of power and growth and into questions of pure distribution and pure efficiency and whether a market economy can function efficiently. Really quite increasingly abstract versions of that. And that kind of dominates increasingly economic thinking for the next century or so, and still does. I mean, this is the essentials of what you get taught if you do an economics course. You get taught about how trade is between freely contracted individuals. They choose to trade. No one's being forced to do anything. There's no question of power imbalances. That's just how the economy operates. So that's how the mainstream of economics tends to think about this. That's what tends to get taught on the courses. And of course it does. I mean, you can say it performs quite a useful function in that if you're not talking about power, you never get into a question of who holds power and whether they should and what they might do with it.
Matthew, is this just about money, or is there something else at play here when we're talking about economic power?
Yeah, I think James has summed up quite eloquently, but I think if you look at the distribution of income and wealth that we've seen in this country in the last 40 years, you've seen a distribution away from the bottom 50% to the top 1%, especially, and more than that, the top 0.1%. And I think it's been estimated that the top 1%, their income has grown in the last 10 years by something like 124%, which is a lot more than the rest of the population. So when you get wealth inequality and you get a situation where we've now got 151 billionaires compared to probably about 10 years ago, it's scary, isn't it? Because what happens is they tend to have a lot of influence over politicians at all levels. So I think it is really important. I think the ownership of the economy is really important. And I think we've got to look at plural forms of ownership where, like, employee-owned businesses, worker co-ops, public ownership, insourcing, and by doing that we then disperse power down to people. And I think we need to, especially after the result of the election, look at potentially more radical devolution settlement, because we are the most centralised country in the European Union. If you go to Berlin, you have the powers to municipalise your water supply. Here we don't. Mm-hmm. Or if we did, it would be extremely difficult. So I think these questions need to be answered. And I think the power relationships are linked to the wealth in the economy and the inequality.
So it's not just about kind of shifting money, it's also about shifting economic decision making. There's obviously government level that you can do that, but then you mentioned companies as well. I think a lot of this can get quite abstract and people struggle to understand when you talk about ownership in the economy, they struggle to understand exactly what you mean by that. And I think that was part of the problem that Labour hit against when they were talking about some of their policies. It didn't quite connect with how people felt about their lives and what it meant for their lives. Just kind of spelling it out, what do you mean by the economy when you talk about ownership of the economy?
Well, at the end of the day, the people who produce the wealth of a company or an organisation, it's the people who work within it, isn't it? It wouldn't be as successful as it was without the people all making a contribution to it. And the reality is that if you look at the governments of a lot of big businesses, especially larger ones, working people have very little say within it. There's trade union membership that's down at about 39% compared to, I think it was 60% in the 1970s. So that decision-making power is lost within it and that influence. And then if you look at the actual ownership of the companies themselves, again, most working people don't have a stake within it, who work within these companies. So obviously the inclusive ownership fund, which I know James had some, that was involved in drawing that up with John McDonnell's team, that was a fantastic idea. And the tragedy is that we've not been able to get those ideas across, because I think they would resonate with working people if we could get them across. Mm-hmm.
I agree with some of that. I think there's also got to be a bit of a wariness, because it's always like, particularly if you come from a sort of more left-wing or progressive end of the political spectrum, there's always a temptation to go, well, we've got loads of really good ideas, and if only these people would listen to them properly, those ideas would become incredibly popular and that sort of thing. I'm always a bit wary of just saying everything is a pure communications issue. That I think what you've seen for the last 40 years is precisely because so many people feel so powerless relative to the economy. This is the impact of the reduction in trade union membership and trade union influence. Your most obvious way at work where you could claim some power back is to be in a trade union, have that union represent you and take part in what it does. If that disappears, you don't have any power at work anymore. If you try and live your life, just in Britain today, most of the time, big decisions are made about you that you have very, very little say over who's making them, how they make them. Some big multinational company, does it open a new plant, does it close somewhere? You go to the shops, the things on sale are not things that you particularly determine. It's a complete sense of powerlessness. So if you start saying to people, we want to give you some control over what's happening in the economy, it's a really big jump that you're asking to make now. You're having to sort of go from, a situation of powerlessness to saying, well, actually, you could have something. And people are really, they find it quite hard to conceptualise it. So I think there's a degree to which, when we talk about power and ownership and what you might do to move the economy in a more progressive direction, it's as well as the communication, like having to explain and find the words to describe this, we're having to also, I think, put in place steps where people can see bit by bit what the policies are, what the steps are towards having more power in the economy. So it's not just go from here and then everybody's running their own workers' cooperative or something. That's not going to work. But if you can put in place the steps by which you get there, which I thought the Inclusive Ownership Fund, this is the work that people have put in over the last year or so. It comes out of a Cooperative Party paper from summer 2018. The idea with that was that there'll be some steps towards giving people a bit more power and potentially having some money as well. So in other words, you can see, like, people know what money is. You give them power and money and people can see that and they have that. So that was the idea there. And I think this is going to be the challenge for all of us, is going from very big, abstract, what's Westminster going to do about this, into the kind of work I think that Matthew in particular and Preston Council has really been an example of this, of saying on the ground, this is what it means, right? What it means in your town, on your street, if we talk about doing things differently. Can we demonstrate to you right now what it's going to look like? Never mind what might be happening right up at the top somewhere.
But then thinking about that election result for a second, I mean, obviously the Conservatives had this extremely powerful message about get Brexit done, which, you know, corresponds to the 2016 Leave message of take back control. What was actually being offered, though, doesn't seem to offer much in the way of offering people real power. Is that right? Or what was the Conservative offer? Where is it taking back control?
It's. I mean, I think you're right. It was a very sort of thin offer in terms of what they presented. Very thin and very concentrated on get Brexit done as a core message, with a few other bits and pieces they threw in around nurses, you know, with some questionable numbers about how many would or would not be there, more money for police, that kind of thing. So there's a few other bits and pieces there. But in terms of what they said they would do to the economy, it's extremely thin. The great thing about, from their point of view, get Brexit done, and the vote to leave, I think, has this, is a sort of negative assertion of power for a lot of people. They have a system that doesn't work, that visibly and obviously in parts of the country hasn't worked for a really long period of time. People have, you know, low to zero expectations about it ever working, and suddenly you get a chance to just kick it and like see if it does something, and to make that happen. And that's quite a powerful thing that people have. People have a sense of agency all of a sudden that they didn't have before. So people took that opportunity. And the challenge for Labour, if you take the 2019 result, was that you then have a manifesto which says, here's a whole load of things we could be doing. And you go and present it to a bunch of people who are so cynical about the system that they voted leave because they don't think the system can deliver. And you say, actually, the system can deliver. You can have all these nice things. So this is where that kind of problem of presentation and credibility, if you like, about the manifesto starts to creep in. Because people just, there's nothing implausible about the manifesto, right? If you look at it, the headline is that you'll move Britain from being a relatively low public spending economy to one something like a bit lower than Germany or Sweden, that kind of Northern European level of public spending. It's not implausible. Germany and Sweden exist and do these things. There's no real reason why you couldn't do that here. But in people's heads, this is like, this is the system's going to do something nice for you, and no one believes that. So I think there's also that question of not so much get the system to deliver nice things for you, but how do you empower people themselves so that they can get something themselves? And that's a real bind for the left because, as Matthew discussed, if the institutions by which people normally do this, like labour movement institutions, trade unions, aren't really there, there's not very much left. So thinking your way through that, I think, is going to be challenging for us.
Yeah, I mean, that analysis is correct, but there is, I think, much deeper issues as well as what James is saying. I think we've got to look at some of the trends that have happened electorally since the economic crash in 2007-8 and austerity. And people are not getting these messages because I think people are very angry and very upset across the world. I mean, obviously we've had the situation where people voted to leave the European Union. That was unexpected. You had Donald Trump, who was elected as President of the United States. Again, very unexpected. I think it was described as the primal scream of the working class because he carried exactly the same kind of people in America that Boris Johnson carried here. So it's people who've been beaten up in deindustrialised communities. So you're getting these outcomes, which I believe are related to the fact we've had the longest period of austerity in the world in many places since probably the 1930s. So people are acting irrationally. So they're basically voting out of emotion. It's not just America and the UK. You look at Germany, the Green Party, the principal opposition. You look at France, the far right, or I think at 27% of the vote. So things are just not like what they were before. And we're quite down about what happened, or obviously within the Labour Party we're quite down. But ultimately, I think even after the defeat, we're in a much better state on the left than lots of other European countries. And what we do know is back in 2017, when Brexit wasn't on the ballot paper because they thought that had been resolved, we managed to put on, I think, the largest increase in popular support of any party since the Second World War. So I'm just thinking, if Brexit had been resolved, what would the outcome been? I think it would have been quite different, to be honest. So I think we've got to look at these underlying issues about why people are behaving in that way and why they're not getting this message, and then that just asks, what can we actually do now with the Conservative government for 5 years? And what you do see is you see some lots of very radical responses in American cities like Cleveland and New York. I mean, the Deputy Mayor, J. Philip Thompson in New York City, he's talking about creating worker-owned businesses linked to the buying power of the not-for-profit institutions there, and actually getting trade unions to help formulate these worker-owned businesses. And let's talk about technology and get people to self-organise on apps just like Camp to Deliveroo and Uber. And I think a lot of that is the way forward. I think we've got to have this international movement now to for the next few years to support these progressive values, and then potentially we could then link that into whoever the next Labour leader is going to be. I think that's going to be the way forward.
Well, I wanted to pick up on that because I broadly agree, but there's a couple of things that to add to that kind of analysis. The first one is that, look, the decline in Labour's vote goes all the way back to 1997, quite strikingly. This isn't a sudden, because of the manifesto, because of the leader of the Labour Party, it suddenly appeared that all these, historically kind of Labour voting seats have switched over to Conservative. This has been a long time coming, and you can see the decline in the vote. I mean, Labour loses, 4 million votes between 1997 and 2005. Jeremy Corbyn in 2017 put 3.5 million back on, right? So it's like quite an impressive surge, and then this time round we lose a load of votes. I think it's a net gain of 1 million from 2015 to 2019, and it's worth saying that those people who went to vote for other parties voted, about 9% basically for the Tories and the Brexit Party, and about 9% for the Greens and Liberal Democrats. The sort of disappearing of the vote goes to, broadly speaking, parties on either side of the Brexit divide. The biggest single movement is into non-voting. And the places where that happens the most is exactly the sort of places that the Conservative Party won this time round. So it's not, I think there's not that many people actually switch Labour to Conservative. It's quite a lot, but it's not that many. But it's an awful lot of people that are sort of dropping out of voting, which is a continuation of the pattern for the last almost 20 years now. In fact, more than 20 years, from 1997. And that's a common pattern to social democratic parties across Europe. I mean, this disappearance of historic voting blocks because people aren't turning out to vote. And that, in turn, is linked to, I think, again, the decline of sort of the institutions that might encourage people to vote or give them a reason to vote. Disappearance of trade unions, disappearance of, the Labour Party itself withering in a lot of places, disappearance of community centres, organisations, all this sort of stuff just sort of slowly crumbles away over time, and then that with it goes the votes that Labour once upon a time was able to deliver. It is going to be a hard fight back from here. That said, if you're looking at the Labour Party, the number of these places that went to Conservatives are on extremely fine margins. I mean, you're talking a few thousand votes. That also means a load of places are all just hanging on to Labour by a few thousand votes. So it's very, very tight. But that does suggest that, with a sort of correct strategy and the right politics and things, it should be possible to pull some of these places back to Labour, I'd have thought.
Of course, looking at those, both the global trends and the long-term trends, it can present quite a bleak picture for people who do want to have a fairer economy and one that rebalances power. Where are the kind of glimmers of hope? What are the most exciting examples around the world or here in the UK that are doing things differently? I mean, Preston is often held up, Matthew, as, the kind of the beacon of how things can be done differently, and this could demonstrate a different way of running the economy. Are there more Prestons?
Yeah, there's lots of, if you talk about the Preston model, that is something that's been ongoing for about 6 years, but it takes time to bring it to scale. So we've done lots of work around procurement and the living wage and local employment and local investment, but we're now moving towards that democratisation by working with partners to establish a regional cooperative bank, a people's bank, which if you can get institutions like that really popular and embedded in the community, I think it would help parties on the left. And then also we're looking at the worker ownership angle, and we're looking at a sovereign wealth fund type arrangement with the public pension fund and other investments from the public sector. So you put that all together, it's very powerful. But the challenge is this takes time. This can't be done overnight. But if over the next 5 years we get Labour councils and even other councils that are looking at these ideas, and Metro Mayors and the Scottish Parliament, and the Welsh Assembly, doing all of that, it could bring a conversation about a new kind of economy, even with a majority Conservative government. So that's where the hope is, because there's all these seeds which have been laid in the UK with places looking at doing this. There's obviously Birmingham that's looking at it. There's Islington Council. There's Salford. There's Kirklees. There's so many places, North Ayrshire. And for the first time, having a conversation about ownership of the economy in local government. That's something we've had a conversation about for a long time. So it's quite exciting in that respect. As I said before, there's international solidarity with lots of other European cities and American cities now, because they're facing exactly the same issues we have with a failed economy and austerity as well. So I think that's the kind of movement that we need. But the challenge is ideas are wonderful, aren't they? Policies are wonderful, but can you actually bring them to scale at a level that people notice? We're getting close in Preston, but as I said, it takes time. But, if we get all areas actually doing this really powerfully, I think we've got a really big opportunity. But you've got to look at things that people are going to notice, because if you have some kind of managerial response, there's going to be even more decline. And obviously working people won't receive the change that they need from local government and regional government.
How have you found introducing these policies? So we talked a moment ago about how you don't go to kind of the full extent immediately, but you take small steps that gradually increase power in the economy to get people used to the idea. Have you encountered pushback in implementing some of these policies, and where has that come from?
It's not to the level that you might think, because it's not just one idea, there's probably about 10 or 15 together. So I think that's a strength in it. There's been a bit of cynicism, especially by some in the business community about it, because obviously they see it as a bit too radical and shaking things up the way they might not want. But generally it's quite well supported, even by, if you talk about people in the Labour movement, there seems to be widespread support for these ideas, and also outside the Labour Party as well. I think people accept now that Preston or wherever, we've got to look at something new, because the current economic model isn't delivering for people anymore.
The other kind of question in my mind related to the election is that since the result, there's been a lot of discussion of the north-south divide, the town-city divide. How useful do you think those analyses are in terms of thinking about this question of power and who has it? It seems to me that they might be oversimplified, to understate it. But how should we be thinking about the differences in who has power in the economy and on what lines that falls?
Yeah, both myself and James are from the north. Wigan, is that
Wigan,
right?
yeah, that's right.
Wigan, yeah. So obviously we're within about 15 miles of each other. So we both know the level of alienation that we get up in our communities, and I think that's something that's got to be addressed, because these are areas that have been beaten up for ages. Wigan, for example, my dad was from Wigan, and he was from his granddad was from a coal mining community, and these were really stable, well-paid jobs in communities, and they were the bedrock of the community. And obviously, since the 80s, those jobs have all gone away. So in communities like that, you're left with that real sense of alienation and powerlessness. And what the Conservative government have been very good at, in my opinion, is actually restricting the powers and money available to communities to actually participate in community life. That they're left with nothing pretty much. It's how we actually tap into that and make sure that they realise that they've got to do something that's going to help them improve their own lives, and B, how we do it when there's a system that's rigged against communities like that. And if you look at levels of public sector investment, for example, say in transport, there's about 3 times as much down in London there is up in the north. Economic output, Greater London and the South East, it's about 40%. Up in the North East, it's 7%. So it's quite understandable in many ways that people are voting for Brexit, isn't it? Because it does offer them some hope. We can take control of our own destiny. Now, I think it's going to be really bad, the kind of Brexit we're going to get, but you can see how the message appeals. But I think the hope that we have within the left is that I do think that it will be a false dawn. I think people will realise that, and if people promise something that's going to be pretty bad for them, I think eventually people will wake up to it.
Yeah, I think so. It's quite, given the size of the Conservative majority, although you can already see in the withdrawal agreement bill where the Tories are taking this, and they've actually got a fair bit of freedom over what kind of Brexit they might decide to try and negotiate, in particular with the European Union, and where they end up a few years down the line. But there are constraints in this, and there will be a series of sort of big Westminster political rows over where that ends up. The thing I think to watch for with the Conservatives is doing something somewhat against the type we've got used to, which is turning around and saying, okay, we are actually going to try and put some investment into the north of England now, because they will want to shore up those votes. And I don't think they're stupid. And I think they'll sit down and think, well, actually, if we can look like we're delivering something on the ground straight away, that's the quickest way to get that vote to solidify. Because they'll be looking at the margins and thinking, well, that's not, unless we do something pretty rapidly for these people in these places, we're going to lose those ones. So I think they'll turn somewhat against what we've seen in the last It's the last decade under austerity, but really it's the last sort of 40 odd years of neoliberalism with some modifications when New Labour in power, but this sort of draining away of investment, public sector and private sector, from the rest of the country outside of the hotspots in the city centres. And I think perhaps some efforts to try and regionalise some of the spending and for entirely sort of nakedly self-interested reasons on the part of the Conservatives to try and do a version of this. Now, it's quite high risk for them because you build up expectations at that point. You know, like I was saying, when you have nothing at all, you don't really expect anything. And if you get something, you start to feel like, well, can't we have more? Like, there's no guarantee that spending money somewhere, somebody turns everybody into Conservative voters or whatever it might be. So there's plenty of things that can go wrong for them. But I suspect they might try and inch in that direction. But the underlying issues remain, like the distribution of power in this country. I think Matthew touched on it. Like, we have the most centralised political system, basically any sort of northern democracy. I think possibly Japan is a little bit more kind of centralised than here. But when you have local authorities, how much of their budget comes from central government now? 93%, 94%? I mean, it's absolutely huge. They have virtually no control over that spending. They have a list of things they're expected to do, and they're just supposed to go and deliver them. I mean, that has produced under austerity some perverse, really, effects, which is you have Labour authorities, Labour councils, with almost no power themselves to set their budget or do anything, who are having to implement horrendous cuts. I mean, budgets have fallen by 60% for local government in the last 10 years or so. And then people turn around and, of course, blame the local authority. They don't think Westminster. They look straight away at the Labour council in lots of places and say, well, it's you doing it. You're the establishment. That's why I'm going to go and vote Conservative. For a bunch of people, that's what happened. They felt that by voting Conservative, you take on your local authority, your local Labour establishment, never mind what's happening in Westminster. So there's a lot of sort of bubbling around with all this and getting to the point where we have meaningful centres of sort of local power and can rebuild and offer people a sense of sort of opportunity and prospects of doing something different, I think is a long, slow task from this point. I don't think there's any shortcuts to it.
What do you think the prospects for devolution are now? Are the prospects good, or is it going to be a bit of an uphill battle from here?
I think it's going to be an uphill battle. I think that there have been some welcome references to devolution, but the kind of devolution we need is a devolution that we get in European cities, as I mentioned earlier, and even American cities. In some American cities, you can set minimum wages of $15 an hour, ban payday lenders, and just can't do that here. It's got to be a devolution where even if you want to have a more radical socialist programme locally, you've given the opportunity to implement it because you've won an election within your local area, and I don't think that will come. I think we'll get more powers around things like infrastructure and public transport and one or two other things, but that genuine devolution you need to spread democracy and a wide amount of choices within that democracy locally, I don't think that's going to come.
I guess the danger is that you just get devolution of austerity and devolution of a neoliberal economic model without the powers to actually shift how that works.
Yes, and that's why within Preston we're looking to establish our own institution. So if you talk about the Community Savings Banking Association, which is quite exciting, obviously the financial crash and austerity came from the behaviour of the larger banks. And if you talk about power, I think 86% of personal banking is done with the large banks. Obviously, that wealth goes down to the square mile and often ends up in a tax arrangement somewhere. So obviously, by us within the Northwest and in other places establishing the first regional customer-owned banks of the UK, that's how you bring new institutions into it. If you have in Preston, we're building a very large cinema and restaurant development, and we're saying we want it in municipal ownership, and we can then to some degree decide, could we get worker-owned businesses involved in the construction of it? Could we have through the supply chain construction companies that have direct employment? So you get that democracy back in that way. And then I mentioned before about the potential wealth fund we're looking at. Again, that's democratic money in the sense it's the investments of the public sector, including councils and the public pension funds, of which Unison have some influence, and they're very interested in supporting community wealth building through public pension investment. So I think things like that put together, that economic democracy, is what's needed. And if we don't do that, if we don't try to change the system locally, people won't notice it, and we'll end up declining further in our communities. Even if you put the party politics aside, I think there's big questions even after the Conservative victory about the kind of economic model we've got, and can we gradually move to one that's different?
So I guess thinking about the next 10 years maybe in terms of the policies that we should be pursuing. It should be either kind of maintaining as progressives or deepening and furthering. What would your priorities be in terms of shifting economic power? Like, where do we need to be looking and what do we need to be doing, either at a national level or the regional or local? I
mean, the obvious answer, and it sort of feels a bit slightly annoying on the left to be talking about some of these things, but there is the slow trudge, or maybe there's better ways to say it, of institution building, of actually the sort of thing Matthew was talking about, which is that it's not like big dramatic, here we all are in Westminster, snap your fingers, the world's better. It's actually putting in place step by step, getting the institutions that start to deliver and create power on a local basis, and doing it in a meaningful way, doing it in a way that people are engaged with. And that part of that could be exactly as you're talking about community-owned banks, what you've described as democratic money, and keeping institutions that are community-owned and representative of a community and democratic, and building them in places like Preston or other towns across the north and the rest of the country. It can also be things like, can we get more trade unions in more workplaces? Can you get these sort of things? That would be the sort of obvious sort of micro level bits of it. I think there's also some areas that the left needs to think more carefully about, because they're going to be sources of quite significant instability over the next 10 years. One that I think we are now onto in some sense is climate change. The COP is meeting in Britain at the end of this year. So there's going to be, clearly that's going to be a focus for all sorts of policy making here and across the rest of the world. But away from that grand level, I think increasingly the impact of climate change is something that introduces instability into people's lives. Now, do we have plausible, credible solutions to deal with that? You can see what's happened to the weather just in this country over the last sort of few years or so. That's one of them. The other one, I think, is this sort of data economy or sort of the digital economy more generally. Now, this is something that's increasingly wild and uncontrolled and produces all sorts of peculiar side effects, which we got a glimmer of with the Cambridge Analytica scandal last year. And for the more we get into it, the more we develop a sort of digital representation of the world, the more we expand the use of data, particularly things like artificial intelligence, the more this starts to run away from people, the more it's an element of instability. And that is a point, I think, where progressives, people on the left, can potentially start to say, we have some solutions to this instability and insecurity that you're now feeling. There are, by the way, sort of obviously not very progressive solutions to insecurity and instability, and I think we're seeing some of them emerge, but potentially there's space there, I think, to develop a kind of progressive politics.
On the union question specifically, I mean, it feels like everybody's saying, of course, unions need to expand. The unions themselves are saying they're doing a lot to expand. But still, union membership remains extremely low. What do we do about that? Well,
it's bad. I mean, look, there are all sorts of indicators you can look at where unions are. Notionally, on paper, union membership is actually quite high here relative to somewhere like the US. I mean, it's about a third. You said 39%, I think, and it's around about a third or so. It's sort of wobbled around a bit. If you dig into that, that's when you start to get worried about the long-term future of unions, because that's mostly in the public sector. Public sector unionisation is 2/3. Private sector unionisation is down to about 12% or so, right? And then if you go and look at the private sector, you realise a great chunk of that private sector unionisation is in fact former nationalised industries where they retain strong union organisation. Actual private sector union organisation is very, very weak indeed. Union membership amongst the young has fallen off a cliff. It's just not something that people do. And for most people in most workplaces, you simply never see another union member. It's not something that happens, right? So we're a very, very long way back. Notionally, there's this factually, still 6-7 million members in trade unions in Britain. Dig into it and find out where they are, and you're a very, very long way from that. And for a lot of people in the forms of employment they're now into, it is not obvious that the union's there straight away to represent them. If you're self-employed, either actually self-employed or sort of bogus forms of self-employed, if you're having to work through an agency of some sort, it's difficult. There are some of the small unions, I think, doing pretty impressive work around organising people like Deliveroo riders who are all on somewhat dubious self-employment contracts, at least until fairly recently. And there are efforts being put in, but again, this is kind of the small steps that need to happen in lots and lots of different places. That's kind of, I think, to a large extent where we are with the trade unions. I don't think there's necessarily a big push that you can do from the centre to make that happen.
And it does seem to me that there is a kind of cultural problem where if you're a young person who hasn't really seen the power of a collective gathering and trying to make change as a collective, then you're unlikely to have faith that that is something that you should put your money and, quite literally money, but also time into. Matthew, what would your priorities be over the next decade or so?
I just want to pick on what James said about the trade union density. I think it's a really important point, but I think there's some really I think what we need to look at is new opportunities, because there's some really exciting things happening in the United States. Because I think the trade unions, United Sister Union, the Steelworkers Union, they're looking at a concept known as union cooperatives, where you basically get workers to self-organise in a cooperative that's worker-owned, and then the union plays the role of organising the business. And I think that's a huge opportunity within the UK if the cooperative sector and the trade union movement could work together and put aside some differences that they might have had historically. I mean, if you take Patisserie Valerie, that was something that obviously got into trouble on the high street. It got into trouble because of, I think, the business model, which had acquired it a number of years back. And I think it was bought for about 5% of its original value before the price collapsed. Now, that would be fantastic for the trade union movement and the cooperative movement to actually buy it as an employee-owned business in a workers' trust and have it as basically a closed shop where every member would have to be a member of the trade union and it'd have to be a worker-owned business or an employee-owned business. And you look at Richer Sounds and other kind of companies, that's a huge opportunity we have. And I think with with austerity and the election result, we've got to be really creative, because everything's going to be a struggle, and the options we have will be very narrow and limited. So if your options are limited, you've got to look at doing something new and new ideas. So I think that's a real priority, and that's something we could do now. Mm-hmm. And the community banks that have been established, potentially they could look at that as well, but you've got to have open minds to actually do this on all sides. Mm-hmm. And then I just want to concur with what James said. I think new technology, platform technology, that's a huge opportunity to get people to self-organise. And I mean, in Preston, we're looking at things like a civic drone centre. So we're looking to try and produce drones from our aerospace industry and local SMEs to supply the public sector, because they're going to be worth about 620,000 jobs in the economy within 10 years' time. So I think you've got to look at how the economy and technology's evolving. But I think there's a huge opportunity, especially in Barcelona with the digital commons, where I believe they actually collectivised individual data, so that the corporations like Amazon and Google, they've actually got to pay the cooperative to actually access that data. And imagine if we started doing stuff like that here. Yeah. It'd be transformative, but the struggle always is people, especially mainstream politicians, even in my party, they don't like these transformative ideas at times. But I think people are coming around to the argument bit by bit, and I think with the where we are at the moment, both economically and politically, I think these ideas will come to the fore.
I guess that kind of brings me to something that we haven't discussed much, which we should wrap up shortly, but on that question of the big companies like Amazon and big platform companies, I think a lot of the cynicism of these ideas comes from the fact that people think that those companies will leave if you try and do anything to tackle their power. To what extent is that true, and to what extent can either cities, local authorities, or indeed governments try and take on some of these big corporations that hold so much power at a global level, not just at the national level?
It's sort of, I mean, the question with the digital companies, can they, because traditionally it's like, oh, if you have multinationals and they can locate their plants anywhere, and you put more taxes or restrictions on them, they'll just up sticks and go somewhere else, right? They'll go and move all their production to the rest of the world, and that has happened. I mean, you can see it happening. Deindustrialisation in Britain, this is at least part of it, is a movement of plants elsewhere, and you can see, when the Berlin Wall comes down, Eastern Europe opens up, you get relocation of factory production to parts of Eastern Europe because it's cheaper labour. Similar thing happening in China and East Asia. That's a sort of traditional version of this. If you're talking about Amazon and Facebook and some of the big sort of tech companies, they need to be located in Britain to make money in Britain, right? Because that's where they're selling things. That's where they got, in the case of Facebook, this is where all the eyeballs are that are in Britain. So you have to be here. So it's harder for them to simply say, we're going to pull out, because they have to be here. Yeah. The difficulty is saying, well, how do we, for instance, tax them fairly? At the minute, the kind of corporate tax structures we have allow them to basically claim, with a bit of sliding around creative accountancy, they allow them to claim that, for example, Facebook makes all its profits in Ireland, when clearly Facebook is not making all its profits in Ireland, right? It's a big global company. So there's questions about how you introduce more effective versions of taxation, which is taking place at the minute, and some of the rows between, for example, US and France have just blown up and are brewing, I think, in terms of our own sort of future trade negotiations with the US, which is over the taxation of particularly US-based tech multinationals.
Champagne and cheese, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the champagne and cheese is a response to France saying there's going to be 3%, basically a sort of version of the UK's digital services tax on the operations of large corporations, large digital corporations in France. So this is already becoming quite a tussle amongst the big powers that are out there, away from that massive sort of global picture, which is not settled in favour of like multinational corporations just going to dominate everything. I think globally we're going to increasingly see states becoming, or they're already becoming, more important actors. Away from that, Matthew touched on this, that if you look at Barcelona being a leading example, Amsterdam's done something similar, but Barcelona's really sort of raced ahead in this stuff, which is the power of the local authority to be able to say, using its powers of contracting, of procurement, to be able to say, in this case I think it was Vodafone, that you can have a contract with the city government to provide mobile phone services if you also give us access to the data that you're going to be collecting, and we want to negotiate over how that data is used. And the point being, of course, if increasingly it's the data that's the most valuable part of your operations on a great range of whatever you might have be producing or selling, if you can get some control over that, that's a bit of leverage, particularly if you're a local authority and you've got your powers of procurement. I mean, this is part of like what the Preston model was all about. You go and say to big local employers, can you spend more locally? Can you use your powers of spend? Barcelona does something similar, but it does it with Vodafone and gets this result that it can make the data publicly available, in secure, controlled fashion, and then put it to public service. So there is, for instance, in Barcelona, there's a whole website of interesting things you can dig out about what's happening in the city. Where is noise pollution worse, that sort of thing, and they can map that against some of where the local authority is set up, little local council representatives and this sort of thing. So it's quite interesting stuff that you can do around this, and that is where potentially local authorities can start to assert some sort of control and authority over what otherwise very, very large, very powerful multinational corporations do.
Well, we've covered an absolutely huge amount there. What I've enjoyed about the conversation is that even though clearly there are these long-term and global trends that are quite bleak for ideas about shifting economic power, there are also glimmers of hope, particularly at the local level, on how we might push back on some of that. So I want to say a huge thank you to Matthew Brown and to James Meadway for joining me, and thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. To find out more about these topics and the work of the Centre for Economic Justice, visit ippr.org/CEJ. And whatever platform you're listening to this on, subscribe to make sure you catch all episodes of the podcast. Do please also share it with others who'd find it interesting and leave us some feedback. We'll read it all. Thank you.